The whole town warned him that wolves were nothing but trouble, but now he knows the truth. A lonely veteran moved into a $200 snow-covered cabin in Whitefish, Montana, hoping to disappear from the world. But when his loyal German shepherd started barking desperately into the frozen forest, they stumbled upon a dying wolf mother and 4 terrified pups. Saving them would uncover a dark secret, a wealthy developer paying hunters to wipe out every wolf in the region. What this veteran did next would ignite a war in the mountains and give him a second chance he never thought he deserved. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter's night over Whitefish howled cold and merciless snow, swallowing every sound but the wind. Frank Miller, a 67-year-old retired U.S. Army scout, stood alone inside his aging log cabin, its walls scarred by decades of Montana winters and silence. Frank's thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket clung to his broad shoulders, the fabric worn yet dependable, much like the man inside it. His face, hardened by time and wounds no one could see, was carved with deep lines. A grizzled salt and pepper beard framed a jaw once strong enough to command soldiers without raising his voice. His hair, long gone from the top, but stubborn around the edges, curled under his knit cap. His eyes, steel gray, vigilant even in stillness, carried the weight of memories he tried to bury in the snow. Under his hand sat Ranger, his German shepherd companion, only 4 years old, yet already showing the proud build of a seasoned working dog, black and tan fur-pointed ears, always perked, and a sturdy frame trained for discipline. Ranger wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline, a reason for Frank to keep another day going. Frank murmured, "Easy, boy," when Ranger lifted his head. Abruptly, golden eyes trained toward the forest beyond the frost-cloaked windows. Ranger's nostrils flared, paws tense, body stiff, as if the cold night itself delivered a warning. Then came the sound, the faint, distant echo of a gunshot, slicing through the wind like lightning tearing apart the dark. Frank's breath caught his chest, tightening beneath the flannel. Gunfire in winter meant trouble always. And then he heard a cry so full of terror and pain, it didn't sound wild, it sounded pleading. A wolf's howl, broken and desperate. Ranger growled low, a sound like distant thunder ready to break. Frank tried to steady his heartbeat, but 15 years of combat instincts surged through him, as if they'd been sleeping just beneath his skin, waiting. He whispered, damn, knowing what came next would drag him back into a world he left behind. Frank had come to Whitefish to disappear, to let the mountains take his noise, his sorrow, his guilt, and most of all, his rage. Years ago in the military, he'd been a K-9 scout handler, responsible for navigating hostile terrain, with his K-9 partner Duke, a German shepherd, who saved countless soldiers before one mission went wrong. Duke didn't make it home, but Frank did. That fact tore into him far worse than shrapnel ever had. After retirement, an empty home and an even emptier heart led him here. Isolation meant safety, no attachments, no expectations, no grief left to lose. But danger in the wild had a way of finding those who tried hardest to avoid it. Ranger barked sharply, pacing to the cabin door, claws scratching the wood with urgency. Frank hesitated, torn between fear of reopening old scars and the instinct to protect life, any life, from senseless violence. He stepped outside, snowflakes lashing his face as the wind wrenched at his coat. The forest ahead loomed like a black ocean of frost-bitten trees. Ranger trotted beside him, leaving prints that vanished beneath falling snow as quickly as hope. The night smelled of pine and gunpowder. The howl came again, closer now, raw and trembling. Frank muttered, someone's out there herding wolves. Bastards. He hated hunters who killed for sport. Wolves deserved the mountain as much as air deserved the sky. His boots sank deep with every step, the snow thigh-high in drifts. His muscles protested, reminding him he wasn't the same soldier who once moved effortlessly across frozen battlefields. But even now, the old discipline commanded his body. Follow the trail, read the signs, act with purpose. Ranger sniffed the ground, picking up blood scent, fresh, metallic, sharp. They followed it past a fallen pine and into a clearing lit faintly by the moon. Then Frank saw her, a wolf mother, her fur midnight black, dusted with snow, sprawled across the ground. Her breathing came shallow, choked, and her golden eyes flickered like a candle in the wind. She tried to rise, but her hind leg buckled beneath her buckshot wounds, tore through muscle, bleeding into the snow. Frank knelt, his hands trembling not from cold, but from recognition of suffering he knew too well. A life hanging by threads. He whispered softly, voice cracking, "Hey there, girl. I've got you." The wolf's ears flattened in fear, but she did not bare her teeth. Something in her gaze, fear mixed with trust of necessity, held him captive. Ranger approached slowly, tail lowered, as if sensing this was a mother fighting to stay alive for someone else. And that's when Frank saw them, tiny shapes in the shadows. 4 wolf pups, barely 4 months old, huddled together, one with a patch of white on its chest, another, the smallest, and shivering one, bold but limping closer, before retreating, and one with eyes too observant for such a young thing. Pups who didn't understand death, but understood cold and hunger. Frank felt his ribs tighten. He was standing in snow again, a soldier again, someone responsible again. Responsibility terrified him more than bullets ever would. He looked up into the darkness of the trees and whispered to no one and everyone, "Nobody's dying tonight." Ranger barked once firm, as if saluting that decision. With a grunt of effort, Frank shrugged off his thick coat, spreading it gently beside the mother wolf. Her pain was sharp, she whimpered but didn't resist. With practiced movement, he rolled her onto the flannel and bundled her tightly. She was heavy, 90 pounds of muscle and motherhood, and Frank's back screamed in protest. But he lifted, he dragged, he persisted. The pups followed, crying soft, anxious sounds, tripping over their own paws as they struggled to keep up. The storm intensified, wind clawing at Frank's face like icy fingers, but he forced every step forward, the burden behind him, worth every ounce of agony. Ranger stayed alert, trotting in arcs, shielding the family from unseen threats lurking in the black woods. By the time they reached the cabin porch, Frank's legs nearly buckled, and his breath came in ragged bursts. He pushed open the door, heat spilling out like a small miracle against the night. The wolves were inside, alive. Frank slammed the door shut behind them, sweating through the cold. He knelt beside the mother, wiping blood from his trembling fingers. Ranger nudged the pups toward the stove's warmth. Frank stared into the wolf's exhausted eyes and whispered a vow, quiet but iron-strong. "I'm gonna fix this. I'm gonna fix you." And for the first time in years, he felt purpose burn again, hotter than the fire in his stove, stronger than the fear gripping his bones. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, survival breathed. But Frank knew one truth with certainty: whoever fired those shots was still out there, and trouble had just found a man no longer willing to hide. Frank could feel his heartbeat pounding beneath the layers of his thick flannel jacket as he lowered the wolf mother onto an old blanket in the corner of the cabin, near the wood-burning stove whose heat crackled defiantly against the winter's cruelty outside. The warmth inside the small cabin felt fragile, like a dying flame fighting to stay alive, and he knew one mistake could cost the lives of the beings he had just dragged out of death's reach. The mother wolf, her fur a beautiful storm-black shade, lay shivering, ribs rising and falling in uneven stutters. Her eyes, those deep golden lanterns, flickered not with wild aggression, but with exhausted vigilance, a mother praying silently that the stranger before her would not take what she fought to live for. Ranger paced near the four pups, protective but cautious. The pups clung to each other, tiny bodies trembling, fur wet and clumped from snow. Each had a unique mark from nature's brush, one with a narrow white stripe on its muzzle, one with a tear-shaped patch on its hind leg, one noticeably bigger with bold, curious eyes, and one so small and frail that its breaths were shallow whispers against the floor. Frank rubbed his cold hands together, preparing his mind for what needed to be done. He took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp scent of blood and wet fur mixed with wood smoke and fear. His years in the service had drilled into him that when life hung by a thread, hesitation could be the blade that severed it. "Hang on," he murmured to the mother wolf, as though his voice could thread her soul to this side of the world. The cabin's interior reflected a life stripped to essentials. A faded couch patched more times than he remembered, a small wooden table with scars from knives and bottles, a rifle hanging above the door for emergencies only. A single photo frame sat face down on a shelf, untouched for years, like a wound he refused to treat. He pulled his old field medic kit from a dusty drawer. His hands trembled not from the cold this time, but from memory. The last time he had knelt to treat a wounded partner, he had lost Duke. He swallowed the burn rising in his chest. That night still haunted him, the explosion, the yelp that froze time, the way Duke's paws twitched one last time as Frank screamed his name into the smoke. But tonight, he would not lose another partner to senseless violence, even if this partner walked on four paws and belonged to the wild. Ranger leaned into Frank's side, unwavering, reminding him he was no longer alone in the fight. Frank wiped the wolf mother's wounds with warm water from a kettle, revealing scattered buckshot pellets embedded in her hindquarters and along her flank. He recognized the pattern instantly, a hunter's close-range blast meant to cripple, not kill, cleanly. Rage simmered beneath his skin like lava under ice. Hunters, he growled beneath his breath, killing what they don't understand. As he heated a needle over the stove flame, a soft knock startled both him and Ranger. Ranger spun, barking sharply, positioning himself between Frank and the door, hackles raised like rising storm waves. Frank grabbed his rifle, pumping a silent breath through his lungs, before opening the door only a crack. A woman stood on the porch, bundled in a heavy brown parka dusted with snowflakes. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, and she looked to be in her early 40s, with long chestnut brown hair tucked into a wool hat. Her eyes were an earthy hazel, woven with gentle curiosity and worry. Sarah Thompson, a park ranger, whom Frank had spoken to only once before when she'd stopped by months ago to check on wildlife reports. She had a naturally kind but firm demeanor, the sort of person who wasn't afraid of hard work. Her posture radiated confidence, straight-backed practical boots, well-worn from years trekking snow trails. "Evening, Frank," she said, breath forming small clouds between them. "I saw fresh wolf tracks near the road and blood. Thought I'd check if everything's all right." He hated visitors, hated the way people poked holes in the walls he built around his life. But Sarah was not like the others in town who stared at him like a broken relic from another world. She always addressed him with respect, never pity. Ranger relaxed only slightly, ears still forward. Frank opened the door wider, revealing the scene behind him. Sarah's eyes widened at the sight of the wolf mother and pups. She stepped inside carefully, instincts sharp. She clearly respected wildlife far more than most. "Good Lord, you brought them here." "They would have died," Frank replied gruffly. His voice cracked slightly when he added, "I couldn't let that happen." Sarah knelt near the pups, extending a gloved hand slowly, a practiced gesture of non-threat. The boldest pup sniffed her fingers with a soft, hopeful squeak. "These babies look barely old enough to walk," she whispered, voice trembling with empathy. Hunters have been active again, haven't they? Frank nodded, jaw tightening. Buckshot. Someone wanted her to suffer. Sarah's expression hardened. Frank saw a fire in her eyes. This woman didn't just care for nature, she fought for it. She stood and met his gaze. I'll report this. But until Wildlife Services can send help, they're safer here. She retrieved a small pouch from her coat, her own emergency kit, and placed it beside him. You stitch. I'll warm the pups. Working together, they nursed the fragile family. Frank numbed the wounds with leftover lidocaine, removed pellets with steady precision, and stitched flesh with careful hands. When the mother's body relaxed and her breathing steadied, Frank exhaled the breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The pups, wrapped in old towels near the stove, drifted into sleep, their tiny bellies rising gently. Hours passed like minutes. When Sarah prepared to leave, she paused by the door. Snow swirled behind her, illuminated by the amber porch light. Frank, she said softly, not many people would have done what you did. His lips twitched into a ghost of a smile, awkward, unfamiliar. Not many get a second chance to do something right. Sarah smiled back, a warm spark against the winter night. I'll check in tomorrow. Call if there's trouble. After she left, Frank locked the door and stood for a long moment, just listening to the crackle of fire, the soft whimpers of pups, and the steady breaths of a creature who had trusted him with her life. Ranger curled beside the pups, standing guard like a silent knight. Frank placed a hand on the wolf mother's shoulder. You're safe now, he whispered to her, and maybe also to himself. For the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel empty. It felt like a sanctuary, fragile, temporary, but sacred. He knew danger still lurked in those dark woods, stalking the night with greed and guns. Whoever had fired those shots would not stop. And Frank Miller, old soldier, wounded heart, unwilling guardian, was ready to fight back. The cabin was quiet now, except for the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional restless sigh from the wounded wolf mother. Dawn was still hours away, but Frank Miller sat awake in his old wooden chair, his eyes burning with a weariness that no amount of sleep could fix. Ranger lay curled beside the pups, vigilant even in rest. The warmth of the cabin fought against the cold creeping under the door. But Frank's mind remained frozen in the past, in deserts and mountains far from Montana, where the line between man and beast became so thin that losing the wrong companion could shatter a soldier forever. He rubbed the worn leather handle of his pocket knife, a habit that always surfaced when memory came clawing. Duke had been more than a military working dog. Duke was his partner, his shield, the reason he returned alive from missions that should have ended him. And the day he lost Duke, the day Frank last allowed himself to feel attachment, was the day his life unraveled. He never spoke of that mission. He never forgave himself for it either. The wolf mother whimpered softly, and Frank stood wiping the thought away. Not now. This family needed him. He checked the stitches again. They held well. Sarah's emergency supplies were still laid out on the table. Antiseptic salves, bandages, reminders that he wasn't the only one willing to help these creatures. Sarah Thompson was different from the rest of the town. While others saw wolves as monsters or trophies, she saw them as part of Montana itself. She didn't treat Frank like some washed-up relic either. That was something he didn't quite know how to handle. A knock on the window startled him. Ranger bolted, upright, ears rigid, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Frank grabbed his rifle before peeking outside. A figure stood in the snow wearing a faded blue winter jacket, goggles perched on his beanie-covered head. He recognized the young man immediately, Ethan Cooper, early 20s, lanky, with freckles splashed across a pale face that still looked boyish despite the beginnings of a scruffy beard. Ethan was one of the few locals who didn't treat Frank like a ghost. The kid had dreams bigger than Whitefish, always talking about becoming a wildlife photographer. But poverty and responsibility kept him stuck in town working odd jobs. He never lost the spark of curiosity, though. Frank cracked the door slightly. Ethan stomped snow off his boots, eyes wide with concern. "Morning, Mr. Miller. Sarah radioed me, said you needed dog food and maybe blankets. She figured you might not want to leave the cabin." Frank raised a brow. "She sent you out in the dark for that." Ethan shrugged, forcing a shy smile. "She said you'd never ask for help, but definitely needed it." His voice shook a little, whether from cold or nerves, Frank wasn't sure. Reluctantly, Frank opened the door wider. "Come in. Close it quick." Inside, Ethan's eyes grew round as saucers. "Whoa. Are those wolf pups?" He dropped a heavy bag of supplies by the stove, unable to look away. Frank grunted. "They ain't decorations. Keep your distance, they're scared enough." "Yes, sir." Ethan nodded, though his awe overflowed like a kid seeing something magical for the first time. Frank poured hot coffee into a chipped cup and shoved it toward him. Ethan's cold fingers wrapped around it gratefully. "People in town have been talking," the kid murmured. "Hunters coming from out of state. Big payouts for wolf pelts. Someone's bankrolling the whole thing." Frank leaned in, voice low. "You know who?" Ethan swallowed. "Garrett Spence. The resort guy. He's buying up land near the lake." Ethan's expression dimmed. "He wants to turn the whole area into a luxury playground for tourists, no wolves scaring customers." Frank's jaw tightened. He remembered seeing Garrett Spence, once a tall, sharply dressed man in his late 40s, olive skin, slick, dark hair combed back with too much gel, and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating hazel eyes. He carried himself like someone who believed everything and everyone around him had a price. Frank immediately disliked him. Men like Spence were the reason nature bled. Ethan took a sip of coffee and added, "He's paying hunters under the table. They use buckshot because it ruins the hide less. They want trophies and scares." He glanced nervously at the wolf mother. "That's why she's hurt like that." Frank clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. The image of Duke dying under enemy fire collided with the sight of the injured wolf, gasping for life. "Does Spence know these wolves are near my land?" Ethan nodded hesitantly. "Probably. Hunters spotted a den close by. That's why they came here. And they'll come again." Ranger issued a sharp bark as if confirming the truth in those words. Frank exhaled through his teeth, pacing. He thinks he can just erase them. Decide what belongs here and what doesn't. Ethan looked up at him with a mixture of admiration and fear. "Most folks don't push back. Spence has the sheriff eating out of his hand and enough money to buy silence." Frank's lip curled. "Money can't buy a wolf's soul. Or mine." The fire spit sparks upward at that moment, as if agreeing. The wolf mother stirred once more, her head lifting weakly. Her golden eyes met Frank's. There was a flicker of trust in them now, thin as ice, but there. Frank lowered to a knee and whispered, "You're safe. I'll protect them." As Ranger lay close, guarding her flank, Frank felt something pull tight in his chest, a purpose he'd lost long ago. Ethan set down some blankets near the pups and stood. "I should go before the roads ice over. Mr. Miller, you're doing something good here." Frank didn't respond, just gave a stiff nod. Compliments felt like cracks in his armor. After Ethan left, the cabin fell into silence again. Snow cushioned the world outside, but Frank's mind churned. This was no isolated cruelty. This was a war being waged against the wild. Garrett Spence wanted to wipe out a species for profit. And Frank Miller, an old man who thought he had nothing left worth fighting for, now had a cause again. He looked at Ranger, then at the wolves resting under his roof. He whispered the promise he once made on a battlefield to a friend he couldn't save. "No more dying on my watch." The wind howled against the cabin walls. A warning. A challenge. Frank accepted. Night crept over Whitefish with a vengeance, the kind of night that swallowed light whole and howled like a beast starved. Snow fell hard slantwise in the wind, each flake like a tiny blade driven by the storm's fury. Frank Miller stepped outside his cabin boots, sinking into drifts that grew deeper by the hour. His old buffalo plaid jacket whipped behind him like a flag of defiance. He held his rifle low, but ready shoulders tense, eyes scanning the tree line. Inside, the wolf pups whimpered under Ranger's vigilant guard. The mother wolf lay trembling, but alive, strengthened by Frank's hands and her will to fight. Frank had hoped they had one more night of peace. Hope, however, had always been a luxury he never trusted. Ranger's growl rolled like thunder from the doorway. Frank followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw only white, then shadows took shape among the pines. 3 figures advancing with confident, predatory strides. Hunters. Paid killers. The first to step into the clearing was Roy Carter, a man in his late 50s with a body like a felled tree, thick, wide, immovable. His beard was a coarse gray mess, his nose crooked from too many bar fights. His pale blue eyes held nothing but spiteful hunger for power. Roy had once been a respected hunting guide, but greed and resentment rotted him from the inside when tourists stopped hiring him, and Spence offered easy money. Behind him trudged Dale Rivers, younger, maybe mid-30s, tall and lanky, but with a sly look that made his face appear fox-like. His dark beanie barely contained greasy blonde hair, and his thin lips curled into a smirk as he cocked his shotgun. Dale had always been a bully, the kind who hunted not for food, but for the thrill of watching something weaker bleed. The third man looked uneasy, Mark Boyd, early 40s, broad-shouldered with gentle eyes that seemed out of place amidst the cruelty. Snow clung to his brown beard and brown jacket like guilt. Mark used to fix boats on the lake, a quiet, well-liked man who had a daughter, always waiting for him at home. But hard times and mounting bills pushed him into the wrong crowd. He clutched his rifle too tightly, hands shaking. "Evenin', old man," Roy called out, voice dripping with mockery as he stopped 20 feet away. "We heard wolves been hanging around here. You wouldn't be hiding them, would you?" Frank's jaw flexed. He knew the truth. These men weren't here to search. They came to kill. "Turn around," Frank said coldly. "There's nothing for you here." Dale barked a laugh, stepping forward. "Spence says otherwise. Says there's a bounty on one black wolf and her pups. So how about you step aside and let us do our job?" Frank lifted his rifle, slow, deliberate. "You'll step over my body first." Roy clicked his tongue. "I was hoping you'd say that." The storm screamed, louder wind curling around them like a serpent preparing to strike. Ranger growled ferociously behind Frank, teeth-bared fur, bristling a soldier ready to fight beside his commander. Dale raised his shotgun. "Move!" In that instant, Frank's finger tightened around the trigger, but before anyone fired, another voice cut through the air. "That's enough." A snowmobile engine roared into the clearing as Sarah Thompson emerged from the storm headlamp, cutting through darkness like justice itself. Her brown hair whipped around her determined face, hazel eyes burning with resolve. She leapt off the snowmobile, hand already at the tranquilizer gun slung over her shoulder. Her stance was courageous, tall, firm, unstoppable. "What you're doing is illegal," she commanded. "Wolves are federally protected in this region. Drop your weapons." Roy spat in the snow. "Oh, look, the park princess thinks she runs the mountains." Behind her came 2 more snowmobiles, headlights flashing. Ethan Cooper stood on one breath, heaving, clutching a flashlight, and a long metal pole used for search rescue. And beside him, stepping out with careful precision, was Helen Moore, a woman in her late 60s, small but fierce. Her white hair was braided under a wool cap, wrinkles deep, but eyes sharper than any knife. Helen was a lifelong conservationist, known for marching into city council meetings, and calling out corruption loud enough to wake the dead. Tonight, she held a flare in one hand like a torch of war. "We're done letting the rich turn our home into a graveyard," Helen snapped, pointing the flare toward Roy. Mark looked between the two sides, heart pounding loud enough he thought the wolves could hear it. Ethan met his eyes and said not as a threat, but as a plea, "There's still time to do the right thing." Roy scowled and cocked his rifle. "I'm getting those wolves." Frank fired a warning shot into the snow at Roy's feet. Not tonight. The whole mountain seemed to inhale. Then the wolf mother rose, weak, trembling, yet fierce. Her fur bristled like shadowy armor, golden eyes blazing. She limped forward, teeth bared in a silent snarl that declared a mother's final promise, death before surrender. The pups, hearing their mother's call, whimpered behind Ranger, but dared to peek out, tiny bodies shaking, courage and fear intertwined. The hunters hesitated. Something primal, respect, maybe fear, flickered through their hardened faces. Even Roy's confidence faltered for a moment as the storm roared around them, and nature itself seemed to rise against him. Mark lowered his gun first. He said quietly, "I never signed up to kill families." And he stepped back. Dale scoffed but stepped behind Roy, no longer eager. Roy's rage exploded. "Cowards!" He raised his rifle directly at the wolf mother, and Ranger lunged, barking so fiercely the mountains echoed with his fury. Sarah aimed her tranquilizer fast as lightning and fired. The dart hit Roy's shoulder. He staggered backward, dropping his weapon as his body melted into the snow, consciousness slipping through his fingers like sand. Dale cursed loudly and grabbed Roy before he collapsed completely, dragging him away as Sarah kept her gun trained. Mark threw his rifle onto the ground in surrender, breath shaking. The hunters retreated into the storm, swallowed by the dark they brought with them. Frank exhaled slowly, muscles trembling from the weight of what almost happened. He glanced at Sarah. She nodded a warrior's recognition of another. Ethan let out a shaky breath. Helen gripped Frank's arm firmly. "You're not alone in this fight," she said. Frank looked toward the wolves, then at Ranger, still snarling at the darkness. No more hiding. This was war now, and they were ready. The storm had passed, but the mountains of whitefish still held their breath. Dawn spilled gently over the treetops, brushing the world with shades of gold and quiet forgiveness. Frank Miller stood outside his cabin, boots buried in the soft snow that had fallen fresh overnight. Ranger trotted in slow circles near the porch, the German shepherd's breath rising in white puffs against the cold. The pups tumbled clumsily behind him, still trying to understand a world where danger could wait behind every tree, and yet where warmth for the first time existed within reach. Inside the wolf, mother rested, her breathing steadier, no longer fighting through every lungful of air. The stitches across her flank glimmered faintly beneath her dark fur, signs of survival, stitched by a pair of hands she once would have feared. Her golden eyes watched Frank with a mixture of caution and respect. She knew the human had restored life that was slipping from her grip. For a wolf, gratitude was never shown through submission, only through the choice to trust. Sarah arrived early on a snowmobile, thick gloves gripping the handlebars as wind whipped against her wool hat and brown hair. Her hazel eyes brightened when she saw the wolves alive and healing. "You did good, Frank," she said with a proud half-smile. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had never backed down from a righteous fight, even when the world told her she was too small or too soft. Frank merely grumbled in response, though his stiff nod revealed more gratitude than his voice ever would. Old soldiers didn't show pride easily, not when humility had been carved into them by war and loss. But today felt different. There was a lightness in his bones he barely recognized, hope, perhaps. Purpose. A car pulled up along the snowy road, a dark green SUV with the official insignia of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stamped on the side. Two officers stepped out, Agent Robert Hayes, a tall African-American man in his late 40s, with a clean-cut jawline and calm but piercing brown eyes, and Agent Maria Delgado, early 30s, with olive skin, dark hair, tied into a sharp ponytail, and a posture that spoke of discipline learned from years in the field. Hayes introduced himself with a firm handshake. "We received the evidence you sent photos of the kill site's bullet casings location tracking." His voice was deep, but even belonging to someone who measured every word. "We've been investigating the illegal pelt trade here for months. Your report finally gave us the missing link." Delgado scanned the area, noting footprints, the reinforced door of the cabin, and the wolves inside. "It's worse than we expected," she admitted, eyebrows narrowing. "Funds, weapons, and bribery, Garrett Spence crossed too many lines to stay protected anymore." Frank's chest tightened at the mention of Spence, the man who decided life in the forest was expendable so long as profit shined brighter. A man who hadn't cared what families he destroyed, wolves or humans. Hayes nodded grimly. "We have Spence in custody and federal charges are being processed. Interstate wildlife trafficking, orchestrated hunts, he'll be facing prison for a long time." Justice long overdue finally breathed. Ethan Cooper joined the group a moment later, his freckles bright against his flushed cheeks as he shivered in an oversized parka borrowed from Helen. He carried his camera slung around his neck, the first time Frank had seen him, without nervous hesitation, guiding his steps. Ethan's eyes weren't just hopeful today, they gleamed with purpose. He had spent the morning mapping the data Frank helped collect: track sightings, hunter routes, documented injuries. "I'll make a photo series," Ethan said, determination shaping his young voice, "to show people who these wolves truly are, not monsters, just a family trying to survive." Helen Moore arrived shortly after, marching through the snow like the mountain's own guardian spirit. Snowflakes sparkled against her braided white hair, her expression fired with triumph. "I've already written 3 letters to the governor, 2 to wildlife advocacy groups, and 1 directly to Spence's investors," she declared, chin high. "They'll think twice before they ever try this again." Sarah laughed softly. "Helen is a one-woman army." Helen winked. "At my age, fear becomes boring. Fighting feels better." Frank found himself smiling, genuine, warm, surprising, even to him. As the morning stretched, Frank prepared the mother wolf and her pups for their return to the forest. Though his heart tightened at the thought of letting them go, he knew wolves were not meant for walls and roofs. They belonged to the wind, the trees, the hunt, to freedom. He knelt beside the pups first, scratching the biggest behind the ears until it yawned and tumbled into the snow. The smallest nudged its head against Ranger, who responded with a gentle lick. Ranger looked at Frank, ears perked, eyes soft, almost asking for permission to miss them. Finally, Frank turned to the mother wolf. She rose slowly, wounds still tender, but no longer threatening her life. For a brief moment, her nose brushed the back of Frank's hand, her touch light as snow yet heavy with meaning. Her gaze held his fierce and knowing. A warrior to a warrior, a parent to a protector, a life saved to the one who saved it. Then she turned, calling to her pups with a deep, steady sound. One by one they followed her toward the tree line, pausing at the edge of the woods. The mother wolf looked back one last time, eyes glowing like embers refusing to die out. A silent promise shimmered in the winter air. This family would never forget the human who stood between them and death. Frank breathed out slowly, watching, until the white swallowed them completely. Ranger nudged him with a soft whine, and Frank rested a hand on the dog's head. "You see that, buddy?" he murmured. "Saving them might have just saved me, too." Ranger leaned into him. Together they stood beneath the quiet snowfall. For the first time in decades, Frank didn't feel like a ghost wandering through the world alone. The cabin behind him no longer felt like a hiding place, but a home shaped by compassion and protected by loyalty. Where grief once built walls, love had cracked them open. where silence once suffocated purpose now sang. And in the wild heart of Whitefish, justice had finally chosen the side of those who cared enough to fight. Frank Miller stepped back inside the cabin with Ranger close behind, ready to face whatever winter or man dared to bring next. He was no longer disappearing. He was living. Sometimes miracles don't come as lightning in the sky or thunder in the mountains. Sometimes they come quietly through an old veteran who chooses compassion over anger, through a wounded wolf who finds the strength to stand again, through a loyal dog who never stops believing in the goodness of his human. And maybe, just maybe, these moments are God's way of reminding us that every life, big or small, human or animal, has worth. That love is a gift He asks us to give freely. That protecting the weak is a holy act even when no one is watching. In our daily lives, we all face storms, loneliness, fear, loss, the weight of memories we wish we could forget. But just like Frank, sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness to change everything. One choice to stand up for what is right. One moment where God whispers into your heart, "You are not alone." If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Your city, your state, or your country. And if you believe that God's light still shines in unexpected places, click subscribe and join this community of people who still choose love, even in a world that often forgets it. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps, and fill your days with small miracles, just like the one in this story. Thank you for watching, and may His grace always find you.